Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel on the green post-pandemic recovery. So the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the interconnectedness between the environment and our livelihoods. Climate change is our next big challenge, so it needs to be a focus point post-pandemic. As we work to rebuild our economies post-pandemic, it is critical to focus on a green recovery that centers on climate justice. So I have some incredible panelists today. Thank you all for coming. First, I will just introduce myself, and then I'll introduce you guys, and we can hop into some questions. So a little bit about myself. I'm actually a high schooler, so I'm 15 and I'm really passionate about sustainability. Right now I'm working on two main projects. One is building transparent and flexible solar cells leveraging nanomaterials, and then the other is developing a bioplastic from duckweed. So I'm working in two labs there, and yeah, just like trying to make impact within the environmental sector. So launching into intros, Galib Katra is an innovative environmental systems and grant management professional. Right now, he is working as a contracted senior scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Sonam Villani is a sustainable urban development professional and has collaborated with businesses and governments across the globe to design inclusive, innovative, and sustainable urban environments. Denise Amiot is the president and CEO at Colleges and Institutes Canada and was previously the president and CEO of the Canada Science and Technology Museums Corporation. And then lastly, we have Brooke Thompson, a Native American scholar currently in progress towards her MS in environmental engineering at Stanford University. So thank you again for joining me. I think before we actually launch into questions, Denise, you had a presentation on this topic, so we can just start off with that, and then we can go into the panel.
So it's a pleasure to be here with you. For us, of course, the topic of sustainability is a topic that is extremely, extremely important, and especially when we talk about a post-pandemic recovery. First, I thought I would give you some context in my talk today so you will know where I'm coming from. So I'm the CEO of this association, Colleges and Institutes Canada, that was mentioned. And you must wonder, what are all those little purple dots on the map of Canada? In fact, those are our members across the country. So they represent all the campuses. Of course, when we talk about sustainability, we talked about sustainability from a five-prong approach, if you want. So first, of course, because we have this huge real estate across the country, you saw the little purple dots. So for us, it's very important to talk about greening our campuses. So this can range from saving energy to, of course, doing waste management. Of course, second, the curriculum. So no matter which programs is taught, it's very important for us to integrate sustainability within the curriculum, whether we talked about culinary arts program or if we talked about the constructions program. But of course, we also have specific programs that are directly related to sustainability per se. In fact, we have in our college system over 350 programs that relate either to natural resources or clean technologies. We talk about greening the communities. So this range from capacity building to providing supports for the community. We do research in our college system. We do applied research to help small and medium enterprise with their problems or with issues that they want to solve. So this could include, for example, areas of renewable energy or waste recycling, or to produce to do a product that would in fact take less energy or less material to produce and be as efficient. And lastly, of course, promoting a sustainable culture. So the next slide. will show you, in fact, a report. But this is a report that we did, in fact, in April that shows how we can lead the way to a net zero carbon future. And we have some examples from a training perspective, but we also have internships that can be used that we deliver on behalf of the government. And the report we produce give examples in a variety of areas where we are making a difference. The next slide, and I'm almost done, will show you, in fact, during COP26, we issued 2 weeks ago, in fact, our statement on committing to a net zero campus. And finally, the last slide for you is a very cool project that we deliver right now that will be launched very soon, in fact, but that just got approved to impact climate. And this will focus on the campus GHG reduction awareness, but also the diminution of those GHG with best practices. We will be talking about green buildings and indigenous land stewardship. This is very, very important. And we will be doing that with indigenous communities. And third, we will be having campus living labs to really learn together how we can do better from a sustainable perspectives. So on the last slide, you have my coordinates. If you want to get in touch with me, don't hesitate. I will be pleased to do so. And I look forward hearing all the other speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was very insightful. And now we'll get more into the panel side of things and asking questions. And so basically what I'll do is I'll just throw a question out there and whoever wants to jump in can do that. And then other people can pitch in after that. I'll just be like very conversational. And the first question I have is actually about systematic change. And I think one big learning from COVID-19 has been the importance of resilience in financial systems, because obviously this led to a scramble and the reactions in different countries were vastly different. So the question I have for you is, what systematic and behavioral changes do you think need to be made to reduce the likelihood of future shocks, but also increase society's resilience if something like this were to happen again? Does anybody want to initially hop into that question?
I am happy to jump in. I'm Sonam again, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we sort of saw during COVID was, frankly, lack of coordination among governments, among individuals, among nonprofits. The pieces of the puzzle that make society what it is do not talk to each other, right, and operate in silos. And then you add on top of that all of the politics and behavioral changes that are necessary for human beings to actually abide by rules and regulations set forth by authority figures. And there was just a full breakdown of that entire, how the world should work. And, business as usual. And I think coming out of COVID, a lot of what has transpired is actually collaborative conversations between these different entities to ensure that both the recovery as well as what the world is going to do in the future to promote things like economic justice, social justice, climate justice are much more collaborative in nature. I actually just spent 2 weeks in Glasgow at COP26, which is the UN's big climate conference. And I can say that about 85% of the people I met were actually there for the first time. And, as the name suggests, this is the 26th year that this conference has been happening. But I think in the past, it's tended to be more governments and nonprofit organizations. And this is frankly the first time where the business community has come together as well, right, to bring about sort of sustainability changes within their own organizations, within the products they provide to consumers, and how we as sort of society can also change behavior more collectively.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add on to what you were saying with communication in the time of COVID, because for us, I guess one of the lessons learned and one of the benefits of going through COVID is many Indigenous communities are in remote areas, and there's a technological divide and also a physical divide getting to meetings and hearings, for example, water legislation or public policy in general. And so for us in the past, it's been very difficult to have a say within policy and participate as the public because of that gap. And actually being forced into COVID has allowed a lot of agencies to make their meetings accessible online, has forced them to start doing them via Zoom. And also tribes like mine got funding to have cell towers put up. So a lot of my reservation got Wi-Fi and cell service for the first time ever. And that's been a big benefit to us, because now all these people who are affected by these policies within our traditional homelands can now finally have a say. And the accessibility it's still an issue, but it's not as much of an issue as it was pre-COVID. And so I think one of the things that we should take as a lesson learned from COVID is to increase accessibility for peoples, right? Because it's not only Indigenous peoples, but those with different abilities and are disabled or abled in different ways also have an issue to getting to these meetings and public hearings. So how can we make it more accessible to everyone? Not those that just have free times on, 1 p.m. on a Tuesday to make a public hearing. And how can we make the most underrepresented voices have more of a say going forward? And how do we continue with this momentum even post-COVID?
That is a great point. And actually, just to follow up for you, have you seen any positive changes or regulations within accessibility, within COVID in other countries that you think could be implemented worldwide? Have you seen any good initiatives that you think need to be, taken up more?
Off the top of my head for myself, I can't put my finger on anything in particular, but in general, when it comes to kind of Indigenous progress as a whole, I usually look to New Zealand and the Maori people as an example, because they tend to do a lot better than the rest of us, even though they still have their own issues and problems. But I think they have a much better job of giving representation.
It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question in terms of policies and programs that can work in other countries. I'm a strong believer in local initiatives and local ideas, and the fact that you can't really export a particular program from one country to another country. Just the other day on the radio, on National Public Radio, I was listening to some pundits talk about the fact that in the US, you need to electrify 3 or 4 major cities in order to start climate change and in a positive direction and reduce emissions. And then they had the audacity to say that they were then going to put together a blueprint and export it to other countries. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. The regulatory environment in the US is very, very different, especially on energy, that it makes it pretty irrelevant sometimes for other countries to do so. And so this whole imperialistic idea is something that I think has to be avoided when you talk about the best practices from one country to another country. I think the best practice are the fact that many small towns and countries and big cities have adopted a net zero target. Each of these targets are different. They're each measured in different ways. But to me, that's the most important sort of global best practice.
And I actually did want to, oh, sorry. Was that an echo or was someone trying to speak? Okay, might have been an echo. Okay, yeah. Well, something I did want to hit on that I think a lot of you briefly mentioned was that funding part of things. And green recovery measures are still actually a very small part of COVID-19 spending. It only represents around 21%, and there's still massive funds being allocated to not so great for the environment measures. So overall, how do you think the government is doing with regards to funding and spending, and where do you see the biggest areas for improvement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think having worked in government in my previous life, I think, one of the biggest challenges is, one, how do you actually raise money to pay for all of this stuff, right? What are tax policies that are implemented, whether on a national scale or a local scale, to raise revenues, to invest in resiliency measures and adaptation measures in addition to mitigation. Gala pointed out that so many cities, small and big across the world, have climate action plans. And one of the biggest issues is that, we have all these mandates set for ourselves, but nobody's really quite figured out the climate finance piece of it yet, right? And globally, we need about $4 trillion a year just on the mitigation side, right? So just to get down, get to net zero and reduce our carbon emissions as a planet, and as human society, right? We are nowhere near that. That said, when COVID happened, right, governments ponied up money left and right, basically within the span of 2 months, right, to create social safety nets that didn't exist and support individuals who may have lost their jobs, or obviously to fund all the public health measures and the hospital systems and whatnot. So, the money is there. It's a question about how do you actually have government actually collect it, and then what do you spend it on? Just one more point on that, right? We talk a lot about mitigation, but adaptation is just as important. I think sometimes gets missed in many of these types of conversations. So if you look at city spending globally, right, only about 20% of city spending goes to proactive adaptation, right? So making your cities more resilient against sea level rise, or hurricanes or cyclones or other natural disasters that are coming in much more frequency, right? Heat waves, what have you. These are, happening here and now. And for every $1 we spend in sort of proactive mitigation or proactive adaptation techniques, we save $7 on the back end, right? And these are statistics that have been proven time and again, particularly in developed countries and developing countries, but the mindset hasn't shifted yet. And I think much more financing also needs to be allocated on some of these adaptation measures.
I'd like, Nela, to add another one also, and it's infrastructure. If I just look at the college and institute system, we did a survey to ask our members what was their needs with respect to deferred maintenance. And we have needs for $5 billion. So those are buildings that in fact are not energy efficient. And this is extremely, extremely important to solve that problem. They are often buildings that are not accessible to everybody also. So this is something that really needs to be addressed as soon as possible. And I'll share a story to show that it helps not only from a sustainable energy point of view, but from an economic point of view. So there is a college in Toronto that is called Humber College. It's a big college. And they had one of the worst buildings on campus, and they wanted to make it net zero. So they approached a number of companies. None of the companies could do it. So finally, they thought, hey, we are a training institution. So we will approach companies again, and we'll say, who would like to learn how to do it? We will help you. And so finally, there is one company that came forward. And now that building, not only did the company learn how to do it, but they did it. That building is the most efficient on campus. It's net zero. And on top of it, that company has learned the skills how to do it. And now they have renovated 5 other buildings for other organizations. So I mention this because when you talk about sustainability, many people think it's only about spending money, but there's also a way to create opportunities for people and opportunities for companies as well.
I have a few thoughts of that too. So when it comes to infrastructure, one is that with politicians, what I've learned in my personal experience is that a lot of times they're going to want to invest in projects that are more showy because of short-term limits. You only have so many years to get a project out. And for example, something I'm really interested in is wastewater, recycled water, things that are underground, just a water system in general. And a lot of times when you repair the water system, even though it's very important to everyone's daily life, because you don't see it every day, it's not usually on people's minds. And so when it gets repaired, you don't necessarily see a difference in your day-to-day life, maybe just a difference in your bill at the end of the month. But it makes a really big difference to the quality of life for many people. But yet politicians don't usually want to spend time and money on that type of infrastructure project because it's not something they can point to where it's going to help them get reelected, as something like a bridge, for example, where it's right there every day. So that's one issue, is like trying to get the public educated and to care about these systems that aren't necessarily right in front of us every day, but still have a big importance when it comes to climate change and justice. And then my other thought is something I'm still learning about and just introduced to is trying to transform our economies, which is largely based on consumption and, you know, throwing away products and getting new ones, versus a more circular economy where we're releasing, reusing, and mitigating the materials, and trying to make that shift. And then again, educating the public to press politicians to want to make that shift. Because when it comes to public policy, really the financing of how we actually implement the policy is everything on the back end.
Yeah, I think Brooke touched on a couple of points I wanted to pick up on. One is the fact that we can all blame governments, and we heard, in COP26, the blah, 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 blah comment. But the fact that governments represent, at least in the West, Canada, North America, Western Europe, governments represent us, right? The politicians are elected by us. And the question is really, how much are we taking on that individual responsibility? I mean, this conference is hosted by the Ismaili Muslim community of Canada. And as Muslims, I believe that the Quran puts it on us to be stewards of the earth, to be the Khalifa is the word that God uses. And that translates to, all the major religions of the earth, be them named or not named, formal or not formal. The idea that responsibility comes to you. So yes, it is about, fixing your water systems and lobbying the governments to do things and electing the right leaders. But there's also that individual responsibility, which I think, coming back to the first question you asked in COVID, I think we missed the boat as individuals. We did not look at that community impact of masks and vaccines and everything. We're only thinking about our own, especially in the US, our own rights. And forgetting about the community as a whole. And the same thing translates to climate. I'm sure Brooke is studying, and others might have studied Tragedy of the Commons, book by Garrett Harding, it was really about grazing your cows on a public land. But today it's really about the climate. It's about you're leaving your dog poop in the middle of the street, fishing, overfishing, leaving the running water, whatever it is. But the idea that you have to take on that responsibility. So Naila, when you ask about financing and whether the financing is going in the right direction, how much are we willing to do it? How much are we willing to pay the extra cost to do it? I had to, my lease was expiring on my car, and I wanted to get an electric car. And it turned out to be $200 to $250 more per month. And I came home and I told my wife, and I'm like, wait a minute, we should be getting a nice Lexus. Like, why get this Prius hybrid plug-in? And she's like, you have to put your money where your mouth is. If you want to be an activist, you have to act and not just talk. And so we did it. And I'm paying more money for my electric car, but at least it's making me realize that I'm playing my part. And each of us, whoever is watching this conference today, has to realize that whether you're buying supplies for your store, whether you're putting in new furniture in your office, or you're buying a new dentist chair, or you're buying apples at Costco, whatever it is, what are the decisions you're making that affect climate? How are you making a choice of the least amount of emissions?
I also just want to build on that, because I think oftentimes, we think of the environment, society, and the economy as all very standalone sectors, very separated, but that's really not the case. And we do need to start understanding their connectedness. We need to realize that everything is contingent on one another. And I think that's a big mistake in society right now. And that's like a lot what I'm researching right now, just that disconnect. So I'm curious, like, do you think that there is a disconnect between sustainability and the business world? And what steps should we be taking to get rid of that disconnect?
Really quickly on that, and then what was just last said with the disconnect, I think there's not only disconnect between business sectors, environmentalism, and policy, or at least perceived, but a disconnect with how we perceive each other. And especially in these countries like the United States and Canada, we're in the Hofstede model, which is a model to see how individual versus collective is one of the parts of it. Each country is. Canada and the US are very high on individualism versus collectivism, meaning a lot of us only think about ourselves and our own contribution within the country versus us thinking about each other as a community, which I'd say a lot of our smaller communities are more collectivism, like within the Native community or within the Muslim community. There's a lot more connectiveness into how what one of us is doing is going to affect another. And I think one of the shifts in values we need to look at is shifting to a more collectivism mindset and how each of our individual actions are going to impact each other's. And where I feel like that comes into fault when it comes to businesses and environmentalism, for example, is that businesses at the end of the day do not have a conscience, they don't have a bottom line except to make money. And that's problematic. So for us, like even recognizing businesses or corporations as people in the US is very problematic to me, versus like my tribe where we're trying to recognize streams or like our river, the Klamath River, as having personhood instead and having wants and needs to survive as a river. But I feel that we need strong policy to guide businesses and what is ethical from how we vote as people going up to the government level versus leaving it on the businesses to decide what's ethical. Because I do not think at the end of the day, they'll make the right decision of what is best for people, but what is best for the business.
Yeah, go for it.
I would say that there are businesses that, in fact, think sustainability. I would not paint all the businesses as entities that are not interested in sustainability, and they have a vested interest because there are more and more consumers that in fact are requesting or expecting them to be sustainable. So, and let me give you a couple of examples of how our colleges help some SMEs, in fact, to solve problems. So, for example, there's a cégep, a very small cégep in Quebec, in Jonquière, which is further north. What they do applied research with SMEs for sustainable supply to help isolated communities to free themselves of their dependency on fossil fuels. And so, and this is very important to develop this this way of having energy without being dependent on some types of fuels. Another one is Cégep d'Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And what they do research on revegetation of contaminated mining sites in order to improve their restoration. And when they do that with those companies. So they learn together how to make it better.
Yeah, and I would even add on to that, right? Small and medium enterprises are the bulk of jobs in most parts of the world, right? And again, as employees of said businesses, right, it's up to us collectively to also work with our managers, our bosses, right? It comes back to the individual action for the collective, for the collective good, right? In helping steer that conversation, right? You know, And that can happen for sure in small businesses where, you know, frankly, there's less bureaucracy, but also in large businesses. You know, one of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called How to Save a Planet. And several months ago, they had an episode on how two employees at Amazon actually started pushing on sustainability issues, right? Amazon being one of the largest corporations in the world. And they were able to push so much that now Amazon is rethinking everything from its packaging solutions to last mile logistics to investing in a huge electric vehicle fleet. And, you know, the list goes on, right? And in addition to the CEO sort of committing some of his personal funds to making investments in new climate technologies. Again, these are two people who started to change things in an organization that I think Amazon has 400,000 employees around the world, right? So all to say that any of that sort of individual action can go a long way. And another point on the business and sort of the you know, silos that Naila, you pointed out, you know, I think one of the things is also a shift in business on what sustainability means, right? So formerly it used to be the corporate social responsibility group, right? The Save the World part of the business would, you know, you'd donate $1 million here, $1 million there to a tree planting effort, for example. And that has completely shifted, right? And again, I think that light bulb went off, frankly, over the past year into, you know, we have to change our practices and our day-to-day operational challenges to address the sustainability opportunities, right? And how to make ourselves much more efficient in how we do business. And I think that shift in mindset hopefully will not only, you know, it's not a 1 year, you know, light bulb moment, but actually will continue over the next several years. And frankly, it's going to be consumers and us who demand that.
Something that you did mention in your first point was like green technologies and investment there. And just going back to that, I think there are like very few recovery measures focusing on innovation in green tech, which in my opinion is a missed opportunity because I do think like a lot of exponential tech like AI and nanotechnology can be used in these fields for positive good. And so how do you think we should be approaching the leverage of tech in the COVID-19 recovery, and do you think that's important?
So I have an easy answer for this one, and it is by investing more funding for research that leads to commercialization. So, for example, the funding that we get in the college system represent only 2% of the entire envelope that in fact goes to research in Canada. And we work in many fields and all leading to commercialization, so to help the economy. And when we do it in a very sustainable way. So for me, this is an easy answer.
Really quick with that, when it comes to infrastructure, one of the issues is that there's not a lot of reward for risk when it comes to adapting new technologies when it comes to building. So we have a lot of available technologies out there that would help reduce our carbon footprints and lead to sustainability. But because of policy making it, as part of policy making it more harsh on builders and contractors, for example, a lot of our infrastructure is built based on city governments, federal governments, and local county governments. And so when they put in bids for projects, they don't necessarily want to do new technologies because they don't need to, and it's cheaper not to. And so if we press to have those entities who are building our public entities and our public infrastructure to adapt these new innovations, it would do a lot of good for all of us, because on the engineering side, because they're not readily used, it makes it more expensive, which makes the bid prices higher. So contractors won't be hired if they suggest something that's more sustainable and green in their building practices, unless it's specifically pushed by the public, or because of liability issues. When it's not commercialized, when it's not readily used, engineers and contractors don't want to put on that liability issue to themselves versus concrete, which they've been using for hundreds of years, when a lot of growth can be done in this sector and area, and we already have a lot of technologies. It just needs to be pushed more, and it's not something that's readily in the public mind.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Brooke, right? I used to work at City Hall in New York, right? And, there's so much effort on promoting economic development, working with new startups to help them grow. But at the end of the day, it's just procurement, right? New York City is a place that it spends $100 billion a year, right? We are one of the largest spenders of public dollars in the world. Yet the vast majority of that funding goes to already established organizations and businesses. And I think there needs to be a huge sort of shift in how we actually de-risk those technologies to be utilized and frankly, not just piloted, but actually scaled within our public realm. On the point of infrastructure, about 75% of the built environment and the urban infrastructure of 2050 is yet to be built, right? So, throw my $100 billion figure out of the water, right? There's so much opportunity here to get it right if we're able to de-risk that with R&D funding from federal governments, right, who have the resources through things like NOAA and the Department of Energy and loan programs, right, and cheap financing. Another piece is around sort of marrying the product development process with the policy development process, right? So having somebody from your Department of Transportation sitting there with a startup, developing recycled asphalt, right, and checking off, the aggregate mixture, the rigidity, the durability, all of the components that make something viable for public use during the process that it's being developed. And I do see government starting to do that, right? New York, London has a clean tech cluster. Toronto has worked with Waterfront Toronto and Villiers Island that they're trying to turn into a climate hub, right? But you need to basically supercharge many of these efforts if we're going to meet all the mandates that we have set for ourselves in 2030 and 2040 and 2050 in terms of GHG reduction.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, a couple of things that jump out at me. One is that, tech, I would distinguish between tech with a little t and tech with a big T. And tech with a little t is infused everywhere, right? It's present in everything. As you read out, I currently consult for NOAA Fisheries, and even on fishery management, there is so much technology involved, but it's not chalked up on a budget to the tech sector. It's chalked up to fishery management. So it's there, it's everywhere, and just like it is everywhere in our houses. So I wouldn't diminish the amount of technology ideas that are being used for recovery, for climate, and for infrastructure development. Jumping to the other side, the sort of the big T, yeah, you have efforts in research and development, but it's important to look at the full life cycle. And Brooke talked about policies and programs of government to actually get things done in procurement. Both Sonam and Brooke talked about procurement problems and bottlenecks and ideas of sort of let's just stick with the status quo because we don't want to spend the money on new things. But there's also another piece of it that I think people have to keep in mind is you can invent, you can innovate, but sometimes you can't actually get it done. We're sitting here in North America. Canada and the US has zero offshore wind production of energy, unlike Europe, zero. And why is that? The R&D is done, the stuff is developed, there are wind turbines that exist that are piloted in different states and provincial waters, but not in offshore federal waters, both in Canada and the US. And it's not just a matter of policy, it's a matter of protest, people fighting it for different reasons, not because they don't want green energy, but because they don't want other things, or they find ways to fight technology when it comes into play. So you have to look at it as a whole system.
If I may, I just want to say, I believe this week is the week of circular economy that is starting. And this morning on the news, it was quite interesting because they were talking about reuse of construction materials. And Vancouver is one of the rare cities in the country that has legislation that oblige any houses that were built before 1950 cannot just be demolished. They need to reuse the materials. And they were saying that, in fact, that material is of a better quality than what you would have today. The wood is of a better quality, and even the bricks are better because they don't have holes in them compared to the bricks that we do now. But imagine what it would be if more cities in Canada would have such a legislation to reuse the material. I believe there's something there. And I know that in some cultures, they do that all the time, to reuse the materials that exist, but it is not ingrained right now, certainly in North America, and we need to do it.
Awesome. No, I think that's kind of a great concluding part to our discussion. Before we do end off, I just would love to get a takeaway from everybody, or just a message, and then yeah, that'll be the end of the panel. So, Nam, do we want to start with you, maybe?
Yeah, go vote. That is my one takeaway. Be active at the local level, because you can have all the national and global policies you want, but that offshore wind turbine is, across the way, and it's in your ocean, right? It's what you see outside of your window. The recycled asphalt on your sidewalks and your streets, it's, what you step on, right? And the transportation you take to and from school, or or work, right? Public transit in particular, much of the underfunding happens because people don't value it, right? People don't vote for it. So, in the vein of be the change you want to see in the world, go run for office. And if you're not running for office, go vote for people who will actually represent you in office.
Yeah, Denise, do you want to hop in?
Sure, be inclusive. Because for me, it's very important that it's not only for a portion of the population that should think about sustainability, or a portion of the population that can have access to better education or better resources. I'm a firm believer, and the COVID-19 has shown that there are a lot of people vulnerable in our country, and we need to ensure that we support them. We support them with housing, we support them with education, whether it is upskilling or reskilling, and we help them to think sustainability.
Awesome. Go for it, Brock.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of on the same vein, where to think about systematic inequalities when it comes to climate and climate justice, and that a lot of people want to be in this conversation that aren't able to. And so I'm appreciative to be here, but I only speak for such a small portion, and that recognizing a lot of us are connected in intersectionalities that were not always apparent to us, such as when you help folks who are disabled have more accessibility, and when you help folks of different sexuality backgrounds, who are queer, who come from different gender identities. A lot of us have such intersection in these groups that when you help one of them, you're really helping yourself. So climate justice and equality is not just for the sake of having inclusion, but it's really to the benefit of everyone who's involved. So to help others is to help yourself. And I'm just appreciative to be here. Thank you.
Sure. I guess the way I think about it is, humanity is a sum of all humans, and total climate emissions is the sum of each of our individual emissions. And so we each have to cut our own emissions, and you have to spend money to do that. And you have to think about every single thing you do as you make decisions in your homes, in your businesses, in your school life, in your day-to-day life, how you get to work, or which new house to buy. If you're selling a house as a realtor, then you should be talking about the emission savings of that particular house compared to another house. It's unto each of us to do our part. We can't expect governments or corporations to do it by themselves.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for those messages. And thank you for taking time out of your schedules to have this discussion about a green post-pandemic recovery. It was great chatting with you, and I hope you all have a great evening.